Hello, my name's Marty Braden, and I'm the host of the YouTube channel Dispelling the Accusatory Fog. To start off, I want to apologize to my viewers for going a month without a new video. I'm not one for giving excuses, but this time I'm going to give one. For the past 12 years, my older brother has lived with us in our basement apartment. He's 3 years older than me, and for several years now, Don has struggled with diabetes, and on Friday, May 1st, I came home and found he had passed away. And so I've been involved in helping his children take care of his estate and those sort of things. And this is the first opportunity I've had to jump on and do a video I've been wanting to do for some time now. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you some insight I gained recently from watching a podcast created by a gentleman named Alex Arnold. It's titled The Book of Mormon Isn't a Jewish Record, it's an Israelite one. There's a difference. Alex is an Army vet and former skeptic/atheist who studied his way to faith in God and ultimately converted to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons. And as a result of his deep study and research, he is so excited to be a member of the church. So I'm confident you'll be intrigued what I'm going to share with you now. More than 2,600 years ago, 600 years before Jesus' birth, a prophet named Lehi sat down with a collection of ancient records called the Plates of Brass, whose custodian was Laban, a Jewish elder in ancient Jerusalem, and a member of the high-ranking ruling class. In them, Lehi discovered a record of his own family's history for the very first time. He already knew he was an Israelite. He had lived in the land of Jerusalem his entire life and had set up a merchant business and raised his family there. But when he read through these particular records, which was a library of sorts that his community had been maintaining for generations, Lehi discovered something new about his own lineage. That being that he was a descendant of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, which made him a northern Israelite rather than a Judahite. And the record that recorded Lehi's discovery says that Lehi rejoiced when he found out his lineage, which tells us that Lehi didn't know it before reading it from the Plates of Brass. Most people, at least those who are casual about the Book of Mormon and what it says, they read the Book of Mormon more often than not right past that detail. But if you're someone who understands what was happening in Jerusalem around 600 BC, the very starting time from which the Book of Mormon had its beginning, and you understand the difference between northern and southern Israelites' traditions and what that actually meant, especially in their theologies, it changes how you see the entire Book of Mormon. In other words, this is significant because it reframes the entire conversation about the Book of Mormon's authenticity. Knowing that Lehi wasn't just from Israel, but was from the northern branch of Israel that was lost, lets us know it was the one branch that was largely written out of the surviving record. It's the one branch whose theology is almost never considered when people use the Bible as their measuring standard for comparing the Bible with the Book of Mormon. So my goal here in this video is to walk you through what those two traditions were, how they diverged, and what one branch preserved that the other branch edited out. When I do it, it will blow your mind. It certainly did mine. It will also explain why the family at the center of the Book of Mormon's narrative, consisting of Lehi and his family, and those he brought with them, fits the historical context of that lost tradition in a way that Joseph Smith would not have had the scholarly framework to construct in 1828 and 1829 the timeline of his translation of the golden plates into what became known as the Book of Mormon. Around 930 BC, roughly 40 years after King Solomon's death, the nation of Israel split into two separate kingdoms, two separate branches of the tribe of Israel. The northern kingdom kept the name Israel, sometimes called Ephraim, after its dominant tribe, and the other tribe being Manasseh. The northern tribe's religious life centered around locations like Shechem and Bethel. The southern kingdom became known as Judah. It was centered in Jerusalem, organized around the temple at Jerusalem, and was ruled by a Davidic monarchy that claimed exclusive covenant authority. These two kingdoms coexisted for about 2 centuries and were often in conflict with each other. The Jewish nation, the United Kingdom of Israel, split occurred in 930 BC. The northern kingdom existed from 930 BC to 722 BC, and the southern kingdom existed from 930 BC to 586 BC. The northern kingdom of Israel stopped existing in 722 BC because it was conquered by the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The collapse was the result of a combination of political, military, and geopolitical factors. The northern kingdom had been forced to operate as a vassal state, which required them to pay heavy monetary tribute to Assyria in order to maintain its independence. King Hosea of Israel attempted to break free from the Assyrian control by stopping the tribute payments and secretly plotting a military alliance with the Pharaoh of Egypt. When the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V discovered the betrayal, he marched his armies into Israel. He imprisoned King Hosea and laid a brutal 3-year siege to Samaria, the capital city of the northern kingdom. The city finally fell in 722 BC with the conquest completed by Shalmaneser's successor, Sargon II. To prevent any future rebellions, the Assyrian Empire enforced its standard policy of mass population relocation. They deported over 27,000 Israelites to distant regions of the empire, such as Gozan and the cities of Medes. Because these citizens integrated into other cultures and lost their distinct national identity, they became historically known as the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. Historical and archaeological evidence noted by Latter-day Saint scholars and other religious scholars shows that Jerusalem's city walls expanded dramatically during the late 8th century BC to accommodate a massive influx of northern refugees. Because of this discovery, Lehi's ancestors are understood to have been among those displaced northern citizens. Over the generations, Lehi's familial ancestors integrated into southern Jerusalem. They preserved their genealogy on the plates of brass, as I already mentioned, built substantial wealth, and established a rural estate or land of inheritance outside the city walls, which may have originally been part of an old tribal boundaries. In fact, Beit Lehi, also called Kiryat Beit Leah, House of Lehi, is an active archaeological site located about 20 to 22 miles southwest of Jerusalem. The site has generated a lot of excitement among Latter-day Saint researchers and tourists due to several compelling connections to the Book of Mormon story. In Hebrew, Beit means house or estate, and Lehi means jawbone. Local Bedouin Arabs traditionally refer to the area as Beit Leah, which translates to the house of Lehi or the estate of Lehi. Biblically, the name Lehi originates from the place where Samson killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Because Lehi's ancestors migrated to Jerusalem before the Assyrians deported the northern population, they avoided the mass relocation into Media and the subsequent loss of national identity. Instead of being scattered into the north, Lehi's lineage remained intact in the south until God commanded Lehi to flee Jerusalem around 600 BC, just before the Babylonians destroyed that city. The ancient graffiti and drawings carved into the walls of the Jerusalem cave at Beit Lehi do not mention the prophet Lehi by name, but they feature striking thematic, geographic, and chronological parallels to the Book of Mormon narrative. Scholars found 7 distinct Paleo-Hebrew inscriptions dating roughly between 700 BC and 600 BC. The 2 primary translations of the main text by famous linguists Dr. Joseph Nava and Dr. Frank Moore Cross both deeply mirror the language and crises of Lehi's era. Translation A, Dr. Joseph Nava, Yahweh is the God of the whole earth. The mountains of Judah belong to him, to the God of Jerusalem. Translation B, Dr. Frank Moore Cross, I am Yahweh, thy God. I will accept the cities of Judah and will redeem Jerusalem. These inscriptions are the oldest known written mentions of the word Jerusalem in Hebrew ever discovered. The desperate plea for God to redeem Jerusalem matches the exact prophetic burden of Lehi and Jeremiah, who were actively preaching in 600 BC that Jerusalem was wicked and on the verge of destruction, unless God redeemed it due to the people repenting, which they did not do. Alongside the writing, ancient visitors etched crude drawings into the limestone walls. The most unusual and distinct of these are two large merchant sailing ships. Finding ship drawings in a landlocked desert cave 20 miles away from the ocean heavily puzzles mainstream archaeologists. For Latter-day Saints, however, it serves as a powerful visual anchor. Lehi's family famously built a ship to cross the ocean to the Americas. Finding drawings of ships made by individuals hiding in a desert cave from that exact era feels highly symbolic of Lehi's future journey, does it not? The cave walls also depict several human figures. One figure has their arms upraised in a traditional ancient posture of intense prayer. Another sketch appears to show a man playing a stringed lyre, singing laments. There is also a small drawing that looks like a traveler's tent or a temporary camp. According to 1 Nephi 3, when Nephi and his brothers were fleeing for their lives from the wicked governor Laban, they hid themselves in the cavities of a rock outside the city. Some researchers speculate that this specific cave could have been one of the exact hidden outposts or burial tombs where prophets, priests, or Lehi's own sons sought refuge and carved these prayers into the stone walls, hiding themselves. Interestingly, another inscription near the ships translates to a defensive warning: "Cursed be he who will rob the chamber," or "Cursed be the one who erases these words." This indicates that whoever wrote these prayers knew they were living in dangerous, unstable times and wanted their testimony preserved in stone, not unlike the prophets who engraved the Book of Mormon plates. The Assyrians brought in foreign captives from Babylon and other conquered lands to repopulate the vacated territory of Samaria. The remaining Israelite population intermarried with these new arrivals, creating a distinct group known in biblical history as Samaritans. From a religious standpoint, the biblical account in 2 Kings 17 explains that the northern kingdom fell because its kings and people abandoned their covenant with God. They repeatedly ignored the warnings of the prophets, practiced idolatry, and adopted the religious customs of neighboring pagan nations. Then, 208 years later, in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, known today as the region of northern Iraq, southern Turkey, northwestern Iran, and northeastern Syria, destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel entirely. 10 of the 12 tribes were scattered or absorbed into surrounding nations and largely disappeared from the historical record. Today they're known as the Lost 10 Tribes, but the southern kingdom survived. And more importantly, its scribes and priests survived. This religious hierarchy preserved the history as they saw and interpreted it. They shaped their narrative, in other words. You know the saying, history goes to the victor? And so what we now call the Old Testament reflects largely their perspective, the perspective of Judah. What that means is that the biblical record we have today comes primarily from one side of the divided Israel, a side that only remained after the other side had already been removed. This isn't speculation. This is the working consensus of mainstream biblical scholarship. Scholars like Frank Moore Cross and Martin Noth, who are not Latter-day Saint scholars, both have shown that the historical books of the Old Testament reflect a specific theological perspective, one that consistently favors Jerusalem-centered worship and evaluates everything through that lens. Mr. Cross was a prominent Harvard biblical scholar and Dead Sea Scrolls expert his entire adult life. He was the son and grandson of Presbyterian ministers. He was educated at a Presbyterian seminary and described his own background as coming from a Calvinist tradition. Mr. Noth was a renowned German biblical scholar known for his work on the history of Israel, the Deuteronomistic history, and Northwest Semitic epigraphy. He was a European Protestant scholar who worked in the traditional historical school. This perspective is what scholars call the Deuteronomistic history. It runs from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings and presents a unified theological interpretation of Israel's past. In this framework, centralized worship in Jerusalem is always right, whereas northern religious practices are consistently condemned. and national disasters are interpreted as punishment for deviating from the centralized system. The pattern is too consistent to be accidental. It reflects a retrospective theological framing by those who controlled the final form of the text. The most concentrated expression of this perspective comes during the reign of King Josiah, 640 to 609 BC, according to the text, it being 2 Kings 22 through 23, with a parallel record from 2 Chronicles 34 through 35. A scroll, or what was called a Book of Law, was discovered in the Jerusalem temple during renovations. When it was read to King Josiah, it triggered the need for sweeping reforms in Josiah's mind. I'm speaking of such things as centralizing worship in Jerusalem and reshaping Judah's religious life. Josiah used this discovery to destroy local sacred sites, remove competing traditions, and reshape Israelite religion around a single institutional system. Many scholars believe that this text was an early form of Deuteronomy, which helps explain why later biblical tradition reflects that particular southern-centered perspective too. In the process, older traditions were pushed to the margins. Local priesthood practices were delegitimized. Prophetic traditions that emphasized direct encounters with God were suppressed. And religious authority became increasingly centralized. And so, when someone uses the Bible, assembled long after all of this occurred, as the measuring stick for the Book of Mormon, they're using a record shaped by one side of Israel's history only, which is a mistake. This is where Bible scholar and theologian Margaret Barker's work becomes important. Ms. Barker, who is also a lay Methodist preacher from England, is best known for her project known as Temple Theology. She has spent decades reconstructing what she calls First Temple Theology, the religious system that existed before Josiah's reform. While her reconstruction is debated, the idea that earlier traditions were suppressed is widely recognized. According to her work, that earlier tradition included a divine council, a structured assembly of heavenly beings. It allowed for direct access to God through prophetic experience, and it included temple practices and theological ideas that later Judaism moved away from. The idea of a divine council is not based on a single verse. It appears across multiple biblical passages. This idea is that God sits among heavenly divine beings, presiding over that assembly. These passages provide a language that reflects a structured divine order. In addition to Miss Barker's work, scholars like Dr. Michael Heiser have shown that this divine council pattern is embedded in the Hebrew text itself. Dr. Michael S. Heiser was a prominent American Old Testament scholar, author, and speaker known for specializing in the supernatural worldview of the biblical text and ancient Semitic languages. He bridged academia and the church by making complex academic research on the divine council and ancient Near Eastern contexts, accessible to lay people, most notably through his best-known book, The Unseen Realm. It explored the supernatural worldview of the Bible, arguing that recognizing the divine council, spiritual divine beings in other words, is crucial for understanding biblical texts. And then there's Emanuel Taub's work with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Emanuel Taub is a renowned Israeli biblical scholar, famous as the editor-in-chief of the Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project, 1990 to 2009, and the leading authority on textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible. He oversaw the publication of 33 volumes of the Discoveries in the Judean Desert series, making the scrolls accessible to scholars worldwide. Emanuel has demonstrated that some of this language was later edited or altered. Now let's look at the Book of Mormon. Lehi's very first vision is a throne room scene. God on his throne, surrounded by heavenly beings, the divine ones, in other words. That is exactly the kind of vision found in older prophetic traditions. It follows a known literary pattern, one that predates the division between North and South Israelites. Another key difference is how prophecy functions. In the Southern tradition, prophets increasingly operate in tension with institutional authority. Over time, institutional authority becomes more centralized and controlling. In the Northern tradition, prophetic access appears more direct and more consistent. And in the Book of Mormon, prophetic experience is constant. Every generation has prophets. Every generation has revelation. There's also something else that stands out. The Book of Mormon rarely emphasizes figures central to the Southern tradition. David, Solomon, the Davidic covenant. These dominate the Old Testament narrative, but they are largely absent from the Book of Mormon. That absence fits a Josephite perspective, one that does not center its identity on Judah's royal line. As I said, Lehi himself is described in the plates of brass as a descendant of Manasseh. That places him within the northern tradition. But he lived in Jerusalem, which means his family had likely been there for generations, integrated into the city, but still preserving a distinct lineage and theology. This may help explain Laman and Lemuel. They grew up in Jerusalem. They were shaped by its religious system, and that system had been redefined by Josiah's reform. From their perspective, Lehi's behavior wasn't just unusual, it was theologically wrong. Lehi built altars outside Jerusalem. He claimed to see God. He prophesied of a coming Messiah. He operated outside the institutional framework they had been taught to trust. And so their resistance wasn't just personal and due to a lack of faith, it was theological. It reflects the tension between two different religious systems. The brass plates represent a separate record tradition. They contain scripture, genealogy, and writings that weren't found in the Old Testament. They preserved prophets whose names do not appear in the biblical record, and they reflected a textual tradition independent of what was later standardized in Judah. This is not unusual in ancient history, of course, because we know multiple textual traditions existed. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that. Different versions of the same text circulated side by side. Sound familiar? So the existence of a separate record tradition is historically plausible. Is it not? What emerges is a consistent platform. The Book of Mormon reflects a northern Israelite framework, a Josephite lineage, and a prophetic tradition with direct access to God, a theological structure that aligns with pre-Reform Israel rather than post-Reform Judaism. Ancient Israel was not one unified system. It was two kingdoms with two theological trajectories. One survived, shaping the biblical canon and becoming what we now recognize as Judaism. The other was scattered and largely disappeared from the historical record, and the Book of Mormon claims to come from that second tradition. Now, I'm not saying that this proves it's true. What I'm saying is that it does change the question, because instead of asking, why doesn't it match later Judaism, the real question becomes, was it ever supposed to? When you step back and look at everything we've walked through here, a different picture begins to come into focus. Ancient Israel was not a single uniform voice. It was a living, divided world of two kingdoms, two trajectories, preserving and shaping their understanding of God in different ways. One of those traditions survived, was compiled, edited, and ultimately became what we now recognize as the biblical record. The other was scattered, carried away, displaced, and largely lost to history. But lost doesn't mean always gone. What we've seen is that the Book of Mormon doesn't read like it's trying to imitate that latter Southern-centered tradition. It doesn't revolve around David, Solomon, or the royal line of Judah, which causes confusion to some. Instead, it reflects something older, something parallel, a worldview where prophetic authority is direct, where lineage traces through Joseph of Egypt, where the theological structure feels at home in a pre-Reform Israel, before everything was centralized, before one narrative came to define the whole. And when you line that up with Lehi, an Israelite living in Jerusalem, yet tracing his lineage to Joseph of Egypt through Manasseh, something begins to make sense. Not as proof, as I said, but as coherence. Because suddenly the differences aren't liabilities. They're exactly what you would expect from a record that didn't come out of the Southern Kingdom's final tradition, but from the other stream. A stream that was real, that existed, and that history only partially preserved. So, as I said, the question naturally shifts. It's not why doesn't it match what came later? It's what if it was never meant to? What if the Book of Mormon is exactly what it claims to be, a voice from that other Israel? What if it's a record from a people who carried their northern kingdom traditions and theology with them and preserved a perspective that the world almost forgot? If that's even possible, then I have to say that we're not just dealing with a book that stands apart. We may be looking at one that quietly fits right where history left a gap. Okay, now, wasn't this a thought-provoking insight into Israel's and Judah's history? I sure think it was. Until next time, I wish you continued success as you search for truth. And my hope is that you will have and exercise the faith and courage to follow it when you find it. God bless. Love you. Bye.